The last time my father spoke to me as his daughter, he was standing in the marble foyer of the house I grew up in, holding the engagement ring my fiancé had saved 8 months to buy, turning it over in his fingers like it was something he'd found stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "A pipe fitter," he said, not a question. He set the ring down on the side table, very gently, the way you put down something you've decided isn't worth breaking. "4 generations of this family have built something, Quinn. Your great-grandfather laid the foundation for half the commercial buildings in this city, and you want to throw it all away to marry a man who unclogs other people's drains." I was 20. I was 11 weeks pregnant, though I hadn't told him that yet, and I wasn't going to now. I picked up the ring and put it back on my finger. "His name is Beckett," I said. "He's a master plumber. He owns half of his cruise company." "His name," my father said, "is irrelevant." That was the last full sentence he ever said to me before the lawyers got involved. I should back up, because if I just start with the worst of it, you'll think my family were monsters from the beginning, and that isn't true. That's almost the hardest part. They weren't monsters. They were the Holloways of Charleston, South Carolina, and being a Holloway came with a very specific shape you were supposed to grow into, and for 19 years I'd grown into it just fine. My father, Sutton Holloway, ran the construction and real estate development firm his grandfather started. My mother chaired 3 different charity boards and could seat a dinner party of 40 without writing anything down. My older brother went to Clemson, then to law school, then straight into the family firm's legal department, exactly as planned. I was the daughter. I was supposed to marry someone with a name people recognized, host the parties my mother was getting too old to host, and keep the whole machine running into the next generation. I met Beckett the summer after my freshman year, when the pipes in our pool house backed up and the company my father always used sent a kid I'd never seen before. He was 24, sunburned across the back of his neck, and he laughed at me when I asked if it was going to be expensive. "You've got a tree root the size of my arm growing through your sewer line," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's gonna be expensive, but not because of me. Because your granddad planted a live oak 40 feet from a clay pipe in 1962, and somebody should have told him not to." I don't know how to explain what happened next, except that for the first time in my life I was talking to someone who didn't already know who I was supposed to be. He didn't care that my last name was on a building downtown. He thought it was funny that I'd never used a wrench. He had calloused hands and a worn-out truck and a way of looking at a problem and just fixing it, with no committee and no consultant and no 3-week timeline. By the end of that summer, I was lying to my parents about where I was going, and by Christmas I was in love, and by the following spring I was pregnant and terrified, and standing in that foyer, watching my father set my engagement ring down on the table. My mother didn't say anything that night. She stood at the top of the stairs with one hand on the banister, and she watched me leave, and she didn't say a single word. I told myself she'd call. She didn't call. What they did instead was thorough, and that's the part that still stops my breath sometimes. My father had the family attorney draw up paperwork removing me as a beneficiary from the trust my grandmother had left for all the grandchildren. He called the dean's office at the College of Charleston where I was enrolled, and quietly stopped paying my tuition mid-semester. He told the extended family, aunts, uncles, the cousins I'd grown up with. A version of events in which I had become unstable, run off with an older man, gotten pregnant to trap him. By the time the wedding came around, not one person from my side of the family came. Not one. My uncle, who used to let me steer his boat when I was 8 years old, sent back the invitation with no note. Beckett and I got married in the backyard of his mother's house in North Charleston. Under a string of lights his cousins hung between 2 pine trees. His mother cried and held my face in both her hands and said, "You're ours now, baby. You hear me? You're ours." I was 7 months pregnant in the photos. I'm smiling in every single one of them, and the smile is real, and I want you to remember that, because of everything that came later. That day was real. Our daughter was born in August. We named her Wren. Beckett cried in the delivery room so hard a nurse asked if he needed to sit down. He had a daughter and a business that was growing and a wife who, for the first time in her life, knew exactly who she was. We were poor for a while. I won't pretend we weren't. Beckett's company took years to really turn the corner, and there were months we put groceries on a credit card and prayed. I finished my degree at night, online in accounting, and I started doing the books for his company and then for 2 other trade companies in the area, and slowly, so slowly, you almost couldn't see it happening. We built something. By the time Wren was 12, Beckett's company employed 40 people. We owned our house outright. I had my own firm doing the financials for half the contractors in the Low Country. We weren't Holloway rich, but we were the kind of comfortable that you earn with your own 2 hands, and there is no comfort like it on earth. For 18 years, my parents knew none of this. 18 years of birthdays they missed. 18 Christmases. Wren learned to walk and read and ride a bike and play travel soccer and drive a car, and the people who were supposed to be her grandparents never once asked. I sent 2 letters in those years. After Wren was born, I mailed a photo of her with no return address request, just a picture and a single line. Her name is Wren. You have a granddaughter. I never heard back. The second was when my grandmother died, the one whose trust they'd cut me out of, and I found out from an obituary in the paper 2 days after the funeral. I drove to the cemetery alone and stood at her fresh grave, and apologized for not being there. And I drove home and I made a decision that I was done. Done waiting. Done hoping. I had a family. They were just the family that chose me. And then, a little over a year ago, on an ordinary Tuesday in March, there was a knock at my door. I almost didn't recognize her. My mother had always been a tall woman, the kind who filled a doorway, and the woman standing on my porch was smaller than I remembered, gray now where she'd been chestnut. Her hands trembling around the strap of a purse I recognized because she carried one just like it, my whole childhood. She'd been crying. She was still crying. And when she saw my face, when she saw that I was real, that I was standing right there, she made a sound I'd never heard my mother make, a sound that came from somewhere underneath all that Charleston composure. And she said, "Your father is dying." I stood there in my own doorway, in the house I built without her, and I felt absolutely nothing for one long second. Then I felt everything at once. I let her in. I don't know why. Maybe because Wren was at school and I didn't have to explain. Maybe because 18 years is a long time to be angry, and somewhere in there the anger gets tired. I made coffee, because that's what you do, and she sat at my kitchen table and looked at the photos on my refrigerator. Wren as a baby, Wren losing a tooth, Wren in her soccer uniform, and she cried the whole time, quietly, the way she'd taught me to cry when I was little so the help wouldn't hear. His name was the same, Sutton Holloway. But the man she described was not the man who'd set my ring on a table. The firm had not survived the 2008 crash the way I'd assumed it had. My father had spent a decade quietly borrowing against everything to keep up appearances, and then my brother, Golden, perfect, law school brother, had made some catastrophically bad investments with what was left and then disappeared to Arizona with a woman none of them had met. The house I grew up in had been sold 3 years ago. My parents were renting, and now my father had pancreatic cancer, stage 4, and there was a treatment, an expensive one, not covered, that might buy him a year. "How much?" I said. I knew that wasn't really why she was here, but I wanted to hear her say it. 40,000, my mother whispered, to start. I looked at this woman at my table, my mother who had watched me walk out of her house pregnant and frightened and said nothing, who had let me get married with no family, who had never once picked up a phone in 18 years. And I asked the only question that mattered. Why now? Why come to me? She couldn't look at me. "Because you're the only one with money," she said. And then, when she heard how it sounded, she tried to fix it and made it worse. "And because your husband, his company, we saw. We always knew where you were, Quinn. We knew the whole time." That's the part that broke something loose in me. They knew. 18 years they knew exactly where I lived. Knew about Wren, knew about Beckett's company, knew about my firm. They had watched me build a life out of nothing, while they pretended I didn't exist. And the only thing that finally moved my mother to climb my porch steps was the math working out in their favor. I should have thrown her out. Part of me has never forgiven the part of me that didn't. Instead, I told her I'd think about it, and I called Beckett, and that night after Wren went to bed, I sat across from my husband at the same kitchen table and told him everything. Beckett, who had every reason in the world to hate these people, listened to the whole thing without saying a word, and when I was done, he reached across the table and took my hands and said, "Whatever you want to do, I'm behind you. But you don't owe them your peace, Quinn. You already gave them 18 years of it. I want to tell you I made a clean decision. I didn't. I went back and forth for a week. I drove to the hospice in Mount Pleasant, where my father was being cared for, and I sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes before I went in. He was so small. That's what got me. The man who had filled the foyer of my childhood, who had owned every room he'd ever walked into, was a folded-up thing in a bed, his skin the color of weak tea. He turned his head when I came in, and for a second I saw him not recognize me. And then I saw him recognize me, and his eyes filled. "Quinn," he said. His voice was paper. I sat down in the chair beside the bed. I didn't take his hand. We talked for an hour, not about the money. He never once mentioned it, and I think that was my mother's doing, not his. He asked about Wren. He asked what she was like, and I told him she was stubborn and funny and good at math, and that she just made varsity soccer as a sophomore, and he laughed, and the laugh turned into a cough that scared me. He asked about Beckett's company. When I told him 40 employees, 40 families, he closed his eyes for a long moment. I was wrong about him, my father said. I knew within a year I was wrong. I was too proud to say it. And then it had been so long that the being wrong wasn't even the worst thing anymore. The worst thing was the years. There's no fixing the years. I'd waited 18 years to hear something like that. I thought it would feel like winning. It didn't feel like anything I have a word for. Here is what I decided, and I've made my peace with people who think it was the wrong call, because I've heard from plenty of them. I did not give them $40,000. I did not pay for the treatment. What I did was this. I called the hospice, and I paid anonymously for my father to have a private room and the best palliative care money could buy, not to extend his life, but to make whatever was left of it comfortable. I did it because no one should die in pain, not even a man who broke his daughter's heart. I did not tell him it was me. I think he knew. And then I did the thing I'm actually proud of. I sat my mother down and I told her the truth, that I had built a life that didn't have room in it for people who only showed up when there was something to take, that I forgave her because carrying it had gotten too heavy and I wanted to set it down, but that forgiveness and a relationship were two different things, that she would not be meeting Wren, not because I wanted to punish her, but because my daughter had grown up loved and whole and certain of her worth, and I was not going to hand her to people who measured worth in last names and bank balances, and let her wonder, even for a second, if she was enough. My mother cried. She said she understood. I don't think she did. Not really. But she stopped asking for the money, which told me everything about what the visit had actually been for. My father died in June, in a quiet private room, free of pain. My mother called to tell me. I went to the funeral. I sat in the back. A few of the old aunts and uncles were there, grayer, smaller, and one of them, my uncle, the one who used to let me steer his boat, found me afterward in the parking lot and stood there working his jaw for a long time before he managed to say, "We were told things, Quinn, about you. I don't think they were true." And I looked at this man who had sent my wedding invitation back without a note, and I said no, they weren't. And I got in my car and drove home to my family. Beckett was in the driveway when I pulled in, sweat through his shirt, finishing up some project on the porch railing, because the man cannot sit still on a Saturday to save his life. Wren was on the steps doing homework, and she looked up and saw my face and came down to me without a word and wrapped her arms around me. This kid who was nearly as tall as I was now, who smelled like sunscreen and grass, who had never once in her life wondered whether she was worth loving. "You okay, Mom?" she said into my shoulder. I looked over the top of her head at Beckett, at the house we owned, at the life we'd dug out of the ground with our own hands, while the people who'd thrown me away watched and said nothing. "Yeah, baby," I said. "I really am. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, the room I paid for, the forgiveness I gave, The relationship I didn't. They ask if I should have given the money, or if I should have given nothing at all, not even the comfort. I used to think there was a right answer. I don't anymore. My father spent his whole life believing that worth was something you inherited, something stamped on you by your name and your money, and the building downtown with Owe carved over the door. He died in a borrowed room with one daughter he'd thrown away and one son who couldn't be bothered to come home. And I drove away from his funeral to a man who fixes broken things for a living and a daughter who has never doubted she's loved. And I understood, finally and completely, that he'd had it backward his entire life. The people who fix things with their hands, the people who show up, the people who choose you when there's nothing in it for them, that's the inheritance that matters. Beckett gave it to me. I gave it to Wren. And no Holloway, living or dead, ever understood a thing about it. For years I believed the worst thing my father ever did to me was set that ring down on the table like it was trash. I was wrong. The worst thing he did was teach himself, slowly and on purpose, to mistake a person's worth for the carving over a doorway. Everything that happened to him flowed from that one cracked belief. He borrowed against a name. He bet on a son who shared his pride instead of a daughter who'd outgrown it. And in the end, the name couldn't sit beside his bed or hold his hand, because a name was all he'd ever taught it to be. I think about cause and effect a lot now, because my whole life is proof of it. Beckett didn't become a man worth marrying by accident. He showed up to a job most people are too proud to touch, did it honestly, and did it again the next day and the next, for 20 years, until 40 families ate dinner because of work his hands did. That's not luck. That's character built, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. And it's the thing I tried hardest to hand down to Wren. Not money. The other thing. The refusal to measure a person by anything but how they treat the people who can't do anything for them. If I learned anything worth passing on, it's that 3 things carry you when a name won't. The first is simply being decent when it costs you something. I paid for my father's comfort, knowing he'd never thank me, knowing some people would call me a fool for it, because letting a dying man suffer would have made me into something I didn't want my daughter to inherit. The second is using your head instead of your wound. The easy thing was to write a check or slam a door. The harder, smarter thing was to see clearly what that visit actually was, and to draw a line that protected Wren without poisoning myself with revenge. And the third is the plain, unglamorous toughness it takes to keep going. The months we put groceries on a credit card, the night classes after Wren was asleep, the 18 birthdays I celebrated without my mother's voice on the phone, none of that felt noble while I was living it. It just felt like Tuesday. What I'd tell anyone who's been thrown away by people who were supposed to love them is this: you don't get your years back. Sutton was right about that one thing. But you get to decide what those years build. Mine built a house we own, a girl who has never once questioned whether she's enough, and a marriage to a man who fixes broken things for a living, and somehow fixed me without ever knowing he was doing it. My family looked at Beckett and saw blue-collar hands. I looked at those same hands and saw the only inheritance that ever mattered. I was the only one in that whole family who got rich, and I did it the second I stopped letting them tell me what wealth was.